Thanks for logging on to monstergardens.com. We're here to talk to you about a really hot topic, and that's mold and mildew prevention and treatment. So, what are the common types of mold you may find in your grow room? Well, the most common is powdery mildew, or commonly called PM. The other type is Botrytis, commonly also known as gray mold, or just simply bud rot. Now, you might also find rust in your garden, which is a common known fungus. However, it's not as common in indoor gardens as it is in outdoor gardens. So we're mostly going to focus on Botrytis, bud rot, and powdery mildew, PM. So what brings about mold and mildew into the grow room? Well, the most common is low temperatures and high humidity. You can all picture what a dampy basement may feel like. Well, that's a breeding ground for mold. It's often going to be a pretty stagnant room with not a whole lot of airflow, generally a low temperature and a high humidity. Those are all things that are going to really allow mold to grow. So in addition to the low temperature, high humidity, stagnant airflow, what's another way you can bring mold into the grow room? Well, many people don't think about the fact it's a systemic disease. So oftentimes you may have this great set of genetics that you've been running for a while, and then all of a sudden mold crops up. Well, that's probably because you were doing a really good job of keeping the air dry, and you're doing a good job of keeping your temperature pretty moderate, and then all of a sudden things got out of whack and mildew popped up. Well, that's because it's a systemic disease. Now, when you have it popping up like that, a lot of people just think they can snap off the leaves and discard the leaves. The problem with that is as soon as you break a leaf off the plant, spores go flying, and wherever they land, that's a new area for that spore to colonize and bring mildew, cross-pollinate mold all over your grow room. So the best thing to do is catch it ahead of time. Once you see the mildew pop out on the leaves, you've already had the powdery mildew for about 4 weeks. That's the problem, is a lot of people see it pop up and they realize, gosh, what product do I need? Well, at that point it's already systemic, and you're probably better off just scrapping your genetics or using a systemic fungicide approach. So the reason you might see some powdery mildew forming on the bottom portion of your canopy, oftentimes the tops are getting your dry, warm heat from your grow bulbs, and that's going to keep the mold from growing on your tops. However, as soon as you go a next stage down, below the trellis, or just simply at the bottom portion of the plant, the air is often a little cooler, a little more moist, and you're going to have a lot of foliage on top of each other, and that's a breeding ground for mold. So the best thing to do is to use some kind of a fungicide and make sure you really spray the inside of that area, and especially keep your airflow heavy down low. That's why oftentimes we sell the floor fans to people so they can put them underneath the canopy so it just clears that air out. Now, another thing a lot of people don't realize is the fact that mold spores are airborne. So I've talked a little bit about how when you snap your leaves off, the spores will fly. But in Northern California especially, you're going to see a lot of vineyards. Wine grapes and vineyards are a very common area for mildew to be growing. And so if you're in Northern California or areas near where vineyards are, you might want to think about using an intake filter, which is going to be a HEPA grade ideally. What this is going to do, it's going to trap the mold spore into that filter and keep it from entering inside your grow room. So the common thing that Monster Gardens recommends is to clean that intake filter, or to pull the pre-filter off of there and clean it or replace it at least every other run. And that's going to keep the mold from wanting to enter inside of your grow room. Now, the thing also to know is when you do pull that filter off, please do it with your wall fans off, because as soon as you pull that off, those spores are going to fly all over the place and try to land on a new leaf to colonize. So you might be asking yourself, how am I going to go about limiting, reducing, preventing, and treating the mold in my grow room? Well, there's a few different approaches. The most common one that Monster Gardens likes to recommend is the bacterial approach, and that's because this is going to be the most organic option. Here at Monster Gardens, we like to recommend a couple different ones, and that's going to be the Serenade and the Actinovate. Serenade is going to be a liquefied option. They're both going to be a bacterial spore. The only real difference is Serenade is going to work extremely well in a reservoir, like in a deep water culture system, to keep any kind of root rot from forming. However, when you do foliar spray these two products, they're going to actually colonize on top of the leaves. So like I had mentioned, a spore may try to land on top of your leaf. As long as those spores are forming a population on top of the surface of the leaf, it's going to battle that mold spore, consume it, and keep it from even popping up. So you may not even realize that these two products are actually working in your benefit without you even seeing any of the mold spore actually pop up. So keeping these colonies alive on your leaves is the best defense system you could possibly use. Now, another thing that people don't really realize is the fact that the ultraviolet radiation from the sun and the grow bulbs is actually going to sterilize that bacteria and kill off some of the population. So some people are using these products and realizing, gosh, I'm not seeing any result. Well, that's because they're often being the people that are using it once and never using it again. These organic remedies, you're going to have to reapply them constantly to keep that colony alive, because what you need is a greater population of beneficial bacteria than fungal spores. And the idea behind that is so that way they can dominate it. Now, survival of the fittest is common taught in class. Now, if you're the most fit spore, you're going to dominate these species if you have more of a population there. But if you have a greater population of the beneficial bacteria, they're easily going to be the most fit species and consume that fungal spore and keep the mold from at all popping up. So another way that you can go about combating powdery mildew is by building the immunity of the plant. How do you go about doing that? That's with an enzymatic approach that's found in the worm castings. Worm castings has a high level of chitinase. Basically what you're doing is turning the exoskeleton of chitin into chitinase by brewing it into an actively aerated tea, and you're going to basically extract the chitinase enzyme from the chitin that is within the exoskeleton of the worm casting. So the beauty about that is when you foliar spray the chitinase onto the leaves or feed it through the root zone, it's going to actually build the immunity of the plant, kind of like what white blood cells do to humans. Is any of these spores are going to try to dominate your leaves, they're going to try to dominate into your root zone, and the chitinase is going to never even give it a chance. So another common way that you can prevent and treat powdery mildew and mold from growing on the surface of your leaves is by using a high pH solution. By applying a solution with a high pH, it's going to allow the mold to not grow very easily. However, if you sulfur burn, it's another approach of getting a higher pH on the surface of your leaves. So the most common thing that people do is they sulfur burn with the lights off for about an hour or so, 2 to 3 times within the dark cycle. Now, if you do have a serious powdery mildew problem, you're probably going to want to sulfur burn about every day until you see that starting to reduce. And then you can cut it down to about once a week. The thing also to know is with sulfur is it does have a rather awful smell, and it will translate to a flavor in your end product. So we always encourage people to cut off your sulfur burning when you have about 5 weeks left to harvest, and so that way you preserve the high quality product at the end. In addition to sulfur burning by using the prills and the vaporizer, you can actually use a sulfur dust. We encourage people here to use this with our dust miser, and it's really going to be for more basements or from the crawl space beneath the house if that's where you're drawing your intake air from. What that sulfur is going to do is actually change the pH on the ground itself or around the plants that you're dusting it on, and it's going to keep the mold from wanting to spread. A lot of times people will also dust their intake filters, and it stops anything from trying to enter into the room without having to change your pre-filter. So the next product we're going to talk about is potassium silicate. Potassium silicate is often used in the root zone, however we're going to talk about it using this foliar application. Naturally it has a high pH, so what it's going to do when you foliar spray it is not only is it going to act like a surfactant and spread your foliar spray, but it's going to raise the surface level pH. So when you reapply a higher pH to the surface of the leaves, you're actually going to prevent the mold from wanting to grow. Another approach that you can take by preventing powdery mildew from growing, or by at least keeping the colony from growing any further, is by using a dehumidifier. If you can keep your humidity between 45 and 55%, you're actually going to keep the mold from wanting to grow. Here at Monster Gardens, we always recommend people to use dehumidifiers. The reason for that is because there's going to be a huge humidity spike as soon as those lights go down. So the most common time to use it is just in the dark cycle. However, if you're in a more moist area or more tropical region, you may need to keep your dehumidifier on even with the lights on. However, if you get down to the end of your flowering cycle and you may still see a little bit of powdery mildew, that's when the whitewash comes into play, because that's going to basically wash it off the leaves. That way you can harvest your plants without any visual powdery mildew. Now, if all else fails and all these remedies do not work for you, you have 2 different options. At that point, you may realize it is a systemic disease and you may need to just start over with your genetics. The other option is by using a systemic fungicide. Monster Gardens does not recommend this. Again, Monster Gardens does not recommend this, but there is systemic fungicides that are out there. What they're going to do is basically get into the plant system and build the immunity, kill the mold from growing any further, but at the same time, it's only going to be a band-aid for about a 3 to 6 month period. Most of the fungicides on the market that you're going to see in the food industry are actually going to only have about a 30 to 45 day residual. However, they do end up in the testing at the end product, so Monster Gardens does not recommend them to be used. And if you do decide to use them, please glove up, respirator up, goggle up, and do not go back into your room unless your exhaust fans are on and you can properly ventilate your room.